I just went to film and look at this weird blur that's over my camera lens. I'm kind of almost tempted to do the whole video like this, but it does look like sort of season 1 of RuPaul's Drag Race. Let's do this properly. So this week has been a fun one for books, and I want to start off with a book that really blew me away with just what it is able to do. And that is Question 7 by Richard Flanagan. And I'd heard quite a few things from other people about how good this book was. I knew that it had been very critically acclaimed and had received a lot of love from many of the people who reviewed it. And I was just very keen to check it out myself, particularly as I really loved his novel, The Narrow Road to the Deep North. I think I got that the right way around. And his novel, The Narrow Road to the Deep North, is about Richard Flanagan and his family. That it sort of is based on a real life thing, which is that his father was in a prisoner of war camp in Japan during World War II. And so he uses this as a bit of a way to talk about prisoner of war camps and what have you in that novel. And this, therefore, sort of Question 7 operates almost as a companion piece in a really illuminating way, I think. So I think this book is exceptional in so many ways for how it's able to take non-fiction as a genre or a kind of type of writing and play around with how it functions. So often, particularly when we're telling a family story of something like that in non-fiction, a more narrative non-fiction style is used to sort of really go through someone's history from start to finish, maybe with some interjections. And in many ways, Richard Flanagan completely reinvents that feeling. And other writers have done it as well, but it feels like a really fresh way that he's approached this. So what we get in this book is both the history of how the atomic bomb came to be, in various ways. So not only the scientists who initially thought about how nuclear fission might happen, but also the science fiction that sat behind it of how, for example, H.G. Wells and Rebecca West came to sort of date and have this odd relationship with each other, and how H.G. Wells's writing also informed this idea of something like an atomic bomb being possible and how that had its knock-on effects. And so in many ways, this book feels like the logical outcome of almost doing an argument of what if. So if this one small butterfly effect style thing changed, how would that impact the rest of the world? How would it look different if, for example, Nazi Germany had been the first to create the atomic bomb? What would have happened if all these other things in life didn't happen? And what is really fascinating within this is a story ostensibly about his father, and yet so much of the story is about almost anybody else apart from his father. So much so that when his father is introduced, and we do have parts about his father in the book, they feel part of this much wider canvas of something else going on. And particularly that is war, destruction, sort of death drive, all these other things. I found this book utterly fascinating for what it's able to do, I think, in exploding, pun unintended, the idea of biography or of an essay to really be something that's a bit of a hybrid and also somewhat beyond all of that as well. So it's this really fascinating book, I think, that really reflects, for example, on loss as well. He speaks really lovingly about his father and his life with his father, and particularly the way that his father looks back on the past. As I mentioned, he'd been in a prisoner of war camp in Japan, and part of Richard Flanagan's writing in this is to essentially go through his father's history and try to retrace those steps. So he speaks to people who would have been camp guards at the time, people who would have been essentially enacting some of the violence or the kind of control within the prisoner of war camp, to basically see if they felt remorse or how they felt about the whole thing. And he ends up having these really interesting conversations about history, because many of the Japanese people he speaks to have a very different view of how that history went down. And potentially there's also a sense of shame of not really being able to properly reflect on World War II or on the bomb in the same way because of how their relationship with war or with the bomb was very different from, for example, much of Europe. And so it's just this really fascinating book because it shouldn't work. In many ways, it's pulling at so many threads at the same time. But there's something about the way this book builds towards its conclusion that feels that none of those parts could have been taken out. Absolutely none of the parts are added information, that none of them are too much for what is actually going on. And I think this book is really exceptional for how it creates this clear thesis of something that feels like it wouldn't even work as a thesis. Next up, and this book unintentionally speaks to Question 7 by Richard Flanagan, and I think is a really interesting not counterpoint, but kind of accompanying book, and that is The Ministry of Time by Kaliane Bradley. And it was quite fun reading these next to each other in the same week, because in many ways they touch on similar things around how we think about history and how we remember history. So this is a piece of fiction, but I think does some really fascinating things and feels like a really fascinating explosion of how to approach parts of fiction. So the core idea of this book is there is a Ministry of Time, which is essentially a government ministry that is able to fetch people back from the past and bring them to the current day. The beginning of the book is a bit hazier about why this is happening, and there's a sense quite early on in the book that maybe something is being hidden here about why this is happening. But a large part of the book is about this rehabilitation of those people into the current day. So, for example, we start with somebody who was a sailor and an explorer and died on an expedition, and they go back in time to essentially save him before that happens, to bring him into the current day. And what's fascinating is obviously that provides a commentary of our current day, because so much of his life is obviously very alien to us in the current day, but for the people in the present time in this book, they have a lot to explain to him about various parts of what happened. Including really talking about what has happened to his loved ones, because for him, he is absolutely confused about what has happened on this expedition. He was convinced that they were going to survive because they've picked him up from a point just before the end of that expedition when people had died, and they had brought him into the current day. And he, as a result, is very much still living with the idea that these friends are about to show up at any moment, or they're still alive because they're still so real to him. What I think is fascinating about this book is the way that it takes that relatively simple concept in some way of transplanting someone from one time to another, and does so much with it. So it allows for a really sharp critique of current political issues, and including especially around environmentalism, and so particularly looking at what has been done to the planet and where we're at. And so, for example, this sort of man who's been on expeditions is looking at the current day and wondering why so much has been done to pillage the earth. And he's really confused about a lot of that. But it also brings up a lot around the historical perspectives around things around empire, because he talks about his various understandings of Britain in the kind of wider world, and what is fine and not fine to do, particularly in terms of invading or going to foreign lands and trying to claim them as one's own. So it does this really sharp critique on that end, which I think is already something quite interesting. But I think on the flip side, there's something fascinating about the way that the book is then able to look back at the past and to some degree revivify some of the other things that were happening. So you've got this idea of actually maybe there were past times where we tend to look back on progress as linear, but maybe there's a time that we can look back and see that something much better was happening then than where we are now. Somebody trying to explain, for example, housing or technology or various other things to these people often confuses them, because they don't understand why such a thing is needed when actually people were much happier before, or when these other things were happening. So it's really interesting how the book approaches that, and particularly feeds into those conversations. But there are also some really deeply funny bits. There's somebody who is just this wild, rambunctious woman who everyone expects is going to really struggle with the modern day. And she spends her day just basically trawling Reddit forums and finding out really fascinating information. And I just love this idea of this woman from the 16th century just absolutely addicted to this iPhone, basically, and just playing around with it and finding out all this stuff. And she she gets really addicted to using Tinder and all of these other things. I think this book is such a joy, whilst also being a somewhat dystopian look at time travel. It's fascinating. And yeah, I really greatly enjoyed this. And last but not least, I read The Echoes by Evie Wyld. And this is a book that I remember hearing about coming out last year, and I kept on meaning to read and finally got around to. And it's really interesting for how this book approaches loss and love. So essentially, this is a novel. It is focused around two characters, Max and Hannah. And they are in a relationship, but one of them, Max, we learn very early into the book, dies. And as a result, we have this idea of what each partner thought about the other and what was happening. So in many ways, we see so many scenes in this book twice, quite often. Often with what Hannah is currently feeling, often with a sense of survivor's guilt, of how she's currently thinking about her past memories, and how Max is approaching that as this ghost figure who haunts the book. He is in some ways alive. He is a sort of ghost figure, and the book doesn't lean very heavily into a sort of sci-fi or fantasy idea around ghosts. It very much just has him as this floating character, and it then gives this really interesting perspective on the end of Max's life, but particularly of their relationship, of all of these other little moments that have happened that have led to so many things happening. And so it's just really fascinating, because these are never, well, very rarely are these huge stakes. These are often the little things that people in a relationship might cover up or lie about or keep hidden or overreact to, or any of these things. And I think the book does this really beautiful job in allowing both of their stories to coexist and to kind of work out where truth might sit in between those things. And I just thought it was really beautifully done. A really clever piece of writing as well, I think. So those are the books I've been reading this week. I hope you're doing really well. I hope you're keeping well. We finally have some sunshine in the UK. I hope you're doing well, and speak to you all very soon. Have a great week. Bye-bye.